Start this. Okay, folks. Welcome to the start of the SEDA Winter Festival. And who better to start it off than Kay and Sally? I have one sentence of background, which is to say that SEDA has had a difficult year because we've had to cancel both our face-to-face planned conferences, but we'll be back with a vengeance in 2021. There'll be an online conference in May, and we'll be sending details out of that, hopefully during this week. And we hope to resume normal face-to-face operations in December. So 2021 hopefully will be a year to look forward to. This hour is definitely one to look forward to. Kay and Sally have no need for introduction, because if you don't know what they've been writing, particularly over the last few weeks, and I'd just like to start by saying a real heartfelt vote of thanks to both Kay and Sally for the work that they've done, particularly over the last few months, in keeping us all focused on assessment. So we have the chat box, so please join the chat box, please join the Twitter feed, and without further ado, Sally Brown and Kay Samble.
Hello there. Okay.
Hello.
And just to tell you who we are, I'm Sally Brown. I've been in higher education of some kind for about 40 years. And for at least 30 of them, I've been working alongside Kay, because she and I work together at Northumbria. We live about 25 miles apart. And during this awful coronavirus, we've kept each other on the edges of sanity by meeting up most weeks in my garden. Kay, do you want to say a bit about what it's been like in my garden this summer?
So it's very socially distanced in Sally's garden, and as you can imagine, it's very well arranged, and you come in at one door and out the other, and there's an outside loo which is hosed down regularly and all sorts of things like that. So we're extraordinarily safe, and we've managed to produce most of our COVID assessment collection outdoors in the garden. It does get a bit chilly at times in the northeast, but thanks very much to SEDA for sharing some of it in our early days.
And yes, indeed, we've worked all the way through the summer. We have our salopettes, we have our ski coats and our rain hats, and we've even worked from time to time under a Schiaparelli pink umbrella, not umbrella, gazebo. And we'd like to talk to you a little bit about the thing that's been keeping us going all through this summer. If you haven't seen our collection already, in a moment, but not yet, we'll be looking on screen at the COVID resources we put together. These started from us saying, what the heck are we going to do about replacing unseen time-constrained exams, and have now come to a massive set of resources, including, as Kay said, a resource which is why the pandemic, despite all its ghastliness, has actually had huge benefits for educational developers, because we've had to work in ways like never before. Our focus is all about assessment, and our focus is all on saying, let's do it better. If we're going to get away from unseen time constrained exams, let's do it better, and let's make it changed for good in both those senses of that term. So we're very keen to get people thinking about what's going to work well. So the very first one was about contingency planning, and the most recent one that we did was one for SEDA, which was about the educational developers context. We've done it while staying home, and what's been delightful about it is we decided early on we didn't want to wait around for journals, we didn't want to do it as a book, we wanted to get it out there where it was useful. And Kay, can you remember any of the many countries where it's been used? It's been translated into Italian,
Spanish, and Japanese.
Yeah, and used in many other countries. So do feel free. We've been encouraging people to rip it off, take the bits that work for you, and we've encouraged you to let us know things that you found that we haven't found yet. And in all our time, we've been developing thinking about feedback. And feedback for Kay and I, who worked together all those years ago on the assessment for learning settle, well, before the settle, even before then, but Kay and lovely Liz McDowell led the settle at Northumbria on assessment for learning. We've recognised for many, many years how important feedback is, not just as an assessment related device, but also as a learning related device. In fact, we're becoming more and more convinced that for things to work well, we need assessment to be absolutely central. And hence, we've been coming up with this concept of inner feedback. That is not feedback that's handed out by some great professor who is telling you the answer to a thing. Inner feedback comes from within. And I'm going to pause a moment and let Kay say a brief word about inner feedback and talk a little bit, Kay, about what you're doing with Linda Graham as well.
I think we'll come on to that, Sally, if we keep going. So I think at the moment we've kind of flagged up the macro level work that we've been doing. And I think what we want to do today is really dig into the micro level of the module so that we can start thinking about using inner feedback, which I'll explicate in a minute, around ways of building in feedback processes which really help students learn. But shall I just carry on, Sally?
Yes,
I mean, I think it's really fair to say it's been a really challenging time for everybody. So what we're looking for in today's session is to explore some sort of really manageable tactics which help us to build feedback processes right into the DNA of our modules. And I'm thinking, I guess we're thinking ahead now to semester 2. We probably won't be back to business as usual on campus. So we're thinking about ways of building in feedback and inner feedback particularly, and harnessing those so that become part and parcel of the learning environment themselves prior to assessment. So far, so sort of habitual, but what we thought we'd do is just flag up some work by David Carlos about the ways in which we might think about feedback. He's done some work recently, not as yet not published, but he was presenting it the other day around feedback practices, very pragmatic feedback practices, which are undertaken by award-winning feedback teachers at his institution. And just to very quickly gloss through, we know as educational developers, feedback needs to be timely. Students need time to make improvements and change. And Dave Bowd would say, you can't even call it feedback unless it has effects. It's just dangling data or hopefully useful information. It needs to be student-centered, so it needs to tune into things that learners are struggling with. It needs to be interactive and relational. It needs to be a two-way process, so it's joint responsibility or dialogic as feedback. It needs to be relational, and people like Karen Gravitt and Naomi Winston have just written a lovely paper on mattering matters, this idea that educators need to be seen to care about students' progress, and that's not being mumsy. That's about caring whether students do their best and do well, and you feel that they're going to get this thing. Empathy, respect. We recognise that students are often feeling very wobbly because from their viewpoint they're facing failure. So taking feedback on board can be quite problematic from their viewpoint. A good teacher will empathise with that and it will be mutually respectful. And then listening and responding. So it's a sort of responsive method we're trying to look for. On top of all of that, it needs to be manageable. And I've been teaching this semester with Linda Graham, and more of that in a minute. But it absolutely, we're all busting a gut now, students and teachers alike. So it absolutely has to be manageable. And so for me, that means embedding it. And if all that wasn't a sufficiently tall order, we need to support student feedback literacy. So students, especially first years coming to us for the first time, who've had quite a different experience than the one they were expecting, need to feel that they understand how feedback works and develop the know-how to do that. So what we wanted to do in the workshop was a couple of things. First was just to sort of reflect on your experience of approaches to feedback that have worked recently, and ones which are educationally driven. They help students learn, but they're manageable in the current context. And secondly, to move on to consider this internal or inner feedback. Now, I don't know if you've read David Nichols' paper, but if you haven't, I'll give you a quick summary of it. What we wanted to do here was think about internal or inner feedback and then involve you in 3 practical steps. And actually we'll do that in the workshop, hence me sort of ploughing on. 3 practical steps to exploit inner feedback. I'll go into more detail later, but there's 3 kind of bits to do. Produce something, get learners to produce something, get them to compare that, whatever they've produced, with some external reference points, and get them to reflect and explicate or expound what they've learned from that. Usually writing it down helps. So we're going to help you think about that by being on the receiving end of it, and we'll get you involved in the first 2 steps of that process at the start, and then we'll reflect at the end. So you're getting a sort of hands-on experience of doing the process. But then I'll move on to share an illustrative case study that Linda Graham and I have just worked with to show you how some students have responded to this in the last semester. So over to Sally.
Yeah, and just before we go, Helen King's asked, what was the Mattering Matters reference?
Oh, I'll come up with it later.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, so what we want you to do is we want you to produce something, and it wouldn't be a Sally and Kay workshop if we didn't get you doing something. If you haven't got a bit of paper and pen beside you, you'll just have to play with your phone and do it on there. We want you to do 2 very quick things. We're only going to give you a couple of minutes to do this. And what we want you to do is we want you to jot down on a bit of paper, ideally, your definition of feedback in higher education, and then a concrete example of some good feedback practice you've experienced. So the task is very clear. You've got about 2 minutes to do that in. And while you're doing it, I'm going to play you a little Christmas carol. I think I am anyway. No, I'm not. I might have to sing you. Anyway, we'll come back to that. Just do the little task. Hello, Sue Bex. Don't answer now. You're supposed to be on a task. Definition of good feedback. Concrete example of good feedback practice you've experienced. Right, I think that's long enough. And in a normal workshop, you might expect me to say, right, now we're going to share some examples, but that's not what we're going to do. Nor are we going to ask you to put stuff in the chat box. What we're going to do is slightly different. Over to you, Kay.
Okay, so now you've got your product, you've produced something, you've got your definition, you've got your example. First, if you look at your definition, in private, this is fine. Compare that initial definition of feedback with the 2 external reference items we've selected here. So this is the compare bit, or it's an element of the compare bit. So you might think to yourself, does my definition align very closely with this, with a notion of feedback, which is very, very common on the left-hand side? If you talk to most people in higher education, this is what they'll come up with. The idea of feedback as being comments which are given to students, often by a teacher, and they're intended to help the recipient do it better. So you may think, am I more along that line? Or have I thought of feedback? Is my definition more along the right-hand side towards a process? And here I could have chosen all sorts of definitions here to put in as a comparator, but the one I've picked out is from Henderson and the Feedback for Learning website, which thinks of feedback as a process in which learners make sense of information about their performance and use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. So you can have a few minutes, just a few seconds just to think about that, and think about how your product compares with either of those definitions.
And the first definition is very close to our definition that we use in this lovely book, which we did just over a year ago, Professionalism in Practice. The chapter on assessment, that first definition is very close to ours.
And then once you've had it, because we're just trying to illustrate how this process works for you, the next thing you would ask students to do, and you're the analogous students, is to compare your illustrative example of good practice with the ideas that we've provided here. So if you were thinking more along the lines of product feedback as the quality of comments, you might think of things like, you know, avoiding jargon. You might think of focusing on the qualities of the work, not the person. You might think about your feedback being constructive. You might think about it being really realistic and focusing on stuff that students can actually do and change. You might be very mindful of the effective impact of it, the emotional freight that it carries, and giving clear pointers. Other sorts of practices on the right hand side I'll allow you to read, but you can think about all of these kinds of issues to do with process or design issues. Does it have an impact? Have you ensured that it's closing the loop? Have you thought about it as a sequenced iterative process? Have you given it in time for uptake? Is it dialogic? All that kind of thing. How much does it involve students in the co-construction of it? Does it focus on change? So you've got some sort of models there against which you're comparing your own initial productions. So that will make you drive back to yours. And now you've had a chance to think about either of those, either the definition that you first came up with, or the examples of good practice. Have a think about the ways in which they compared with the referent items that we've suggested or brought along there. So is there anything that you've noticed about the way you initially defined feedback in relation to the product, the produce element of the first definition? And are there any good examples of practice that you've thought about that you would be really happy to share? Because I think we've got time, haven't we, Sally?
We have. And what we were going to ask you to do is you might want to go back one slide, Kay, so they can have a look at that last one. What we'd like you to do is, I'll keep reminding you of the task, and what we'd like you to do is we'd like some of you to put some comments in the chat box. So is there anything you've noticed about the way you initially framed feedback, and any good examples of practice? You're going to put those in the chat box, but I would like about 3 or 4 people to give us some things. Might or might not turn their camera on, but they're going to talk to us. And there's a lot of people out there who know I know who you are. So I might actually pick on people if we don't have any volunteers. So I'd like to see some hands up. But if I don't see any hands up, I shall pick on. I want 1 or 2 people to tell me about what you've noticed about the way you initially framed feedback. And I want 1 or 2 people to tell us about good examples of practice. And you're also, Helen King is happy to be picked out. So Helen, what are you going to talk to us about? Are you going to tell us what you noticed?
Yep. Hello. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Helen. And Emma, I've noticed, is there too.
Good, thank you. So what I particularly noticed was about when I first wrote it down, I had teachers as the focus of who was doing the thing. Yeah. So I put down it's a process of peer reflection which provides useful information for improvement and learning. So there was a bit there about the process for the learner, but actually it was being done to them by the teacher. Yeah. Whereas the process definition you had was much more about something that the learner was doing.
Thank you, Helen. And shall we go straight to Emma? Aka Ginger Lawyer. Off you go, Emma.
Hello, everyone. So I'm not actually a kind of academic developer, but I get so much out of the SEDA workshops and love Sally and Kay's work so much that couldn't resist the workshop today. What I was really struck by was the kind of, when I did my PG Cert when I was first new to teaching, I was very much thinking of feedback as being that transmission from tutor to student. It was tutor led, and it was only after kind of 10 years of doing this now and reading more about these works and kind of thinking about my own feedback processes that I'm more now about the process than the product and trying to build that into my own curriculum design. So an example to give to you all of that is where in my second year law module, I had 3rd year students who completed the module the year before that I kind of use them as peer mentors for feedback predominantly. So they are helping the students who within the module, all the formatives are peer and self-assessed. So they're doing their own assessment within the module, but to scaffold and support it for them, because it is different, it is new. There's examples of previous work in the module, building on the work of Carlis and Naomi Winstone. But the peer mentors from the third year are talking them through it, and they speak a language the students understand in terms of feedback that I could never, even though I try to. And that works really, really well. So that was the example I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. And I'd like to go straight to Tracy now, because Tracy's talking about conversations we have after observations on postgrad certs. Tracy, are you ready to talk to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very personalised process, isn't it? And you talk about the events, you talk about what happened, you pick out what went well, you pick out what didn't go so well, and you try and tease out of people what they might do differently next time to enhance their practice. Although I recognise it's probably the type of conversation that's very much a luxury for those of you who are dealing with lots of undergraduates.
Yeah, but picking up on what you're saying, and Kay may or may not want to join me in this, what I'm interested in there is the way the individual's conceptions change because of their own inner feedback. Don't know whether you want to pick up on that, Kay?
Well,
have to.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that everybody has got their own kind of preoccupations, dispositions. They're all on different trajectories here, just in terms of the 3 people who have responded. And of course, the however many 42 that are sitting there thinking, reflecting on this, you'll all have a different take and a different sort of viewpoint. And yet what's happening is you're starting to reflect on what you value, what you might want to do next. You're actually developing inner feedback insofar as you're thinking about what this means to you and what you might take this forward to do. So I think if you think of the process itself as something that's happening to you now, we're already starting to see the lots of diverse ways this can go in moving people on from wherever they are to the next level of feedback. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and certainly it's something that I try and draw out when you're talking about teaching observations. You start with the how did you feel, what did you notice? So it's pulling that aspect out, yeah.
Thank you. And Giles, do you want to build on that? Because you mentioned something in the chat bit.
Yeah, so saying in our OBS feedbacks, we merged them with the tutorials. So we're discussing their teaching more generally overall in terms of what they're trying to do, and do the same as Tracy just said. When we're introducing it, that we start with them and they know that's going to happen every time. But we've also started with a conversation beforehand. And
indeed, that's very much how a lot of us work. David Walker, you, like me, are obsessed with David Sadler. Well, possibly not obsessed, Roy Sadler, sorry. But that particular quote of his where he says, I want the students to be able to achieve a sense of the quality of their own work that matches that of the tutor's sense of quality during the production of it. Do you want to build on that, David?
Yes, Sally, I mean, an approach that I've used in the past and seen done quite effectively is to ask students to write their own feedback using the criteria that's been set for them. And I think that is a really valuable trigger for that dialogic process that you've got here. So really about increasing their agency. But the weakness, as I commented in the chat, is do we put sufficient time and effort and invest that in helping the students to understand the criteria against which they're being judged? I don't think we do enough of that working with course teams, let alone with our students. So I think this is a weakness in that process.
Yeah, and I think we sometimes just gloss over it. Kay, I'm assuming if you want to dip in, you'll dip in.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so I think David Nicholl would call that analytic comparators, things like criteria, task sort of briefs and all of that kind of thing. Where do we use those? And they are comparators which are that students need to really engage with in their heads from wherever they are with regard to wherever they need to go. So the notion of the comparator, I think, is a really interesting one, because what you've done there, David, is broaden it out to not just being analogous things, but to being instruments, if you like, or resources that are out there in the environment, which students will use or can use, but where do we help them and scaffold them into using them as productively as possible? And I think this is where, to my mind, inner feedback is really helpful, because it focuses our attention on doing just that. and doing it over time sequentially.
Now, I know we could go with this all the time, and I know Kay wants us to move on shortly, but just before we do, Kay, do you want to comment? Letitia says, I feel it'd be useful to replace the word feedback with dialogue.
Yeah, yes, up to a point. Although dialogue means such different things to different people, quite often dialogue is taken at face value as actually talking with somebody face to face. And actually it can be much broader than that. And it can be about really unpacking with large numbers, because I think it was Tracy that mentioned, quite often we can't work in those one-to-one environments where, as we do with the supervisor relationship in PhDs, which is often seen as gold standard. So we've got to think of manageable, feasible ways of being dialogic, but often with quite large numbers when you can't enter into that conversation contract necessarily in that one-to-one sort of environment. So I think if we can have an expanded notion of dialogic, sure, but I think it will be, all these terms are problematic because they mean different things to different people.
And I'm picking up again on a comment I've just read here. Oh, they just slide away from you. Ask recipients, says Vicky, to give you their definition of feedback. And this is something we're very keen to encourage during feedback literacy, isn't it, Kay?
Yeah, and I mean, so what we're getting at here is about how far involved the learners, if you think of them as recipients. And I think why I like inner feedback is because it doesn't think of them as recipients, it thinks of them as agents. It places the agency in a different environment within the learner themselves. And I think that's what we're trying to do increasingly in higher education. We're trying to find ways of involving students much more proactively in the feedback process. And we've got lots of different ways of doing that. And this is why I'm particularly fond of inner feedback, because it absolutely starts from that starting point, but starts from the starting point of where the student individually is at as well. So
may I come in, please?
Yeah.
Eva.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk a bit about the agentic element of feedback. I think what often gets lost when we talk about feedback is that we don't reflect on how the student might be equipped with the skills required to make best use of feedback. And one thing I've worked on in designing a transition to HE toolkit for students online learning is to provide them with actual guidelines on how to make best use of feedback by reflecting on feedback. So basically things like, asking questions, viewing it as a learning opportunity, and also, guidelines at the same time for tutors and how to provide good quality feedback. And I think we often need to think about those two elements of the student's capability or capacity for engaging with feedback on the one hand, and the tutor's ability to give high quality feedback. That those two elements, and also assuming that students can become agents of their own self-development with the appropriate guidance, and really scaffolding that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's we often fall into the trap, which is not of our own making, that feedback becomes predominantly the stuff that teachers do. And even then, when Eva, you were talking, it was them making sense of what we have given them. I think what we're trying to do with inner feedback is develop the student's sense right from the get-go. And I hope I'll get time to show you the concrete example that I've just done with Linda Graham, to get them absolutely involved in doing something and reviewing it as they go through the learning environment or the learning design itself. But now we're all looking for these ways of involving students. But I think comments are possibly, from this viewpoint, only part of the jigsaw. And kind of that's what you're saying, I think, Eva. It's one part of the jigsaw, but it's perhaps not the most dominant part, because it's so resource intensive, and quite often it comes a lot later than the students. You want students to start and to spend time on task right from the word go, because we know that that's the way that students learn.
Kay, I just want to quickly say to people, thank you so much for all your comments in the chat box. We will spend many a rainy, wet hour in the garden reviewing those. But now I think probably, Kate, it's time to move on to the next bit.
Okay, so I think that's what we've done. So what I wanted to do was just to share with you a real example. I've been working with Linda Graham at Sunderland University, and we kind of thought, okay, we suddenly found we were going online, and we have to confess, neither of us have taught a lot online. And suddenly, from September or whenever it was, there we were going to be predominantly online with the students. And we thought, well, okay, what are we going to do? And we decided to implement David Nichols' quite new angle on feedback to redesign the whole of this module. So I just want to take you through it a little bit. Now then, if you've read David Nichols' article, all well and good, but I'll just try and pick out the key points from it at the moment for those who haven't. Now, Nichols talks about inner feedback as always being internally generated. It's always something that students do. It always involves them comparing with something, some external reference point. And of course, what students generate depends, that the inner feedback they generate depends on the knowledge and competence they start with, and what they compare that performance against. So it's the main proposition David's got is that students are doing this all the time, some more consciously than others, but it's a natural process. Everyone does it. It's how people learn. We're doing it absolutely all the time. So this is about foregrounding it much more as something that happens absolutely everywhere and all the time, because whenever they engage in a learning task of any description, they're making comparisons with lots of different sources of information in the environment. So this idea is absolutely central, that comparison making is ongoing and pervasive. It's a process which lets them know about how their current performance or ideas relates to what they were intending to do, their goals, and what adjustments to make. So it's absolutely how students naturally self-regulate. And that happens, whether you like it or not, well before they ever receive any comments, because it will happen from the outset of their study. So when you think of it like that, and here's the bit that is mind-blowing, I think, while formal explicit comments are one important reference point of information, those comments alone, what we normally often in higher education think of as feedback, don't actually lead to improvements in learning or performance unless students compare them with their own work and generate internal feedback out of that comparison. So what Nichols is saying is that the comments themselves don't help. It's the process of the students comparing their sense making of the comments with their own sense making about their own work, and to develop on from there. That's why I say it's only one part in the jigsaw. So the way that David Nichols currently defines internal feedback is this: it's the new knowledge that students generate when they compare their current knowledge or competence against some reference information. Now, that's a very different notion of feedback than the ones we've been talking about hitherto, although of course it connects. So it's the new knowledge students generate when they compare their current knowledge or competence against some external reference information. So Linda and I, being us, decided we'd try and help students to generate that internal feedback by building it right through all of our online seminars in the module on childhood studies. These ideas really appeal to us, partly because of the things that people have been saying so far, because we need to engage learners in the process rather than them waiting to be told what to do. They need help to do this. They need to understand their role in the process. I particularly like it because it really resonates for me with what we called in our Centre for Excellence days informal feedback. It's about participating in practice. So I really like the way that this positions students. So what we did, we used it to completely redesign a module by overtly threading comparative reference information and the activities that go alongside that throughout every online live weekly seminar. so that students in the live seminars were making multiple sequential and simultaneous comparisons. Now they were, this live seminar happened each week, was the only time we were together in synchronous time, and all the other material and all the tasks and activities associated with seeding this approach were in the lecture capture and the recordings and all the resources which were made available asynchronously on the virtual learning environment. So I'll just try and quickly take you through what each week involved and what it involves from the teacher's point of view, because it's a very simple model when you get your head around it. What teachers have to do is design a learning task. Now, I mean a learning task, not necessarily an assessment task, so it can be quite low key. They need to select or make available some referent items and then support the learners to compare their own work with those items and wrap that round with discussion and guide the analysis. And then they need to provide time to recap what's happened, what's been learned, and give students time to review, reflect, and react. So that's 3 fairly basic steps. What the learner's role is accordingly to produce a response to the task that's been designed, because that gives the students a mental representation for the comparison, just like we asked you to do the definition and the good examples. The next bit, and this would be predominantly in the seminars, would be to compare their initial response with the referent items. You had a go at that, where you were comparing your initial responses with the referent items we brought along earlier on. And then the final part is to write down or review or think about and then explicate or expound what you've learned, the new knowledge you have generated from engaging in those processes. Now we did this every single seminar week of 9 weeks. And what we got the students to do, just to formalize this, because they were first years, there's about 60 of them coming onto a new program, we wanted to sort of get in their mindset that this was something that was really useful. So we designed a logbook for them to capture their thinking in this way. So they had for each week, they had a produce element. They kept notes when they were comparing on when we were in the live seminars. And then we gave them time to review and generate the new knowledge that they'd derived from engaging in those comparisons. So they were logging that each week as they went through the module. So, and again, that wasn't for assessment, that was their own sort of private backstage process. So I'll just give you a quick sort of feel for the kinds of things which were the comparators. Now I've picked out the sort of what David would call the analogical comparators. And by that, I mean the stuff that, the comparisons that look fairly similar to the sorts of things that the students have just produced. So in the first week, these were very, very low key. So I think it's really important to flag up. This doesn't have to be huge kind of assessment drafts or anything. This can be sort of words about, and I teach childhood studies, so we're trying to get students to think about the different definitions and different meanings of childhood. That's a lot harder than it looks because everybody's been one, and so you're trying to get them to think about associations that they import. So just doing something like a thought shower where they come up with words about that associate with childhood and then compare them with other students' words in chat. We were working in teams or whatever, but also the tutors can chuck their words in and orchestrate conversations around that. So it doesn't have to be, whoops, I've pressed a button. It doesn't have to be huge high stakes things, but you can see we built these in every seminar, and they got progressively more complex as we got into the module. So the 500-word explanation of a key concept came at about week 4 for these students, where they were producing their own explanation of a concept, which was really important. And then the comparators became 3 previous students' examples of answering that question. But we also put in a textbook explanation. which flagged up to some of these students that there were such a thing. And it really drove them into thinking in much more complex ways.
Hey, I'm just going to stop you there because Werner, I've been watching the chat, and Werner's saying, yeah, but what about students with low self-esteem? These are very highly privileged students you're working with down in Sunderland.
They're really not. No, they're so not. So, and I think that's what's the beauty of this, Werner, because they don't have to share. So just as we said, I have not seen all your definitions of the feedback that I asked you to produce at the beginning. I haven't actually, I've heard 4 of you talk, but everyone has had opportunity to write down their definitions and think about it. So you start to build the engagement and the confidence. And these students that I'm working with are certainly not your, typical. They're very widely participation students. This is a big thing for them, and it's a big thing to be online as well. So,
and I've heard you say that the vast majority are contributing into the chat. Do you see?
Absolutely, because they start to do it, but that's why I was emphasizing to start with a very low key kind of example where everybody can put something in, because it's a great icebreaker, but it's an icebreaker with a purpose. So I think it's really helped them. It's been absolutely fascinating for us because you start to see them growing in confidence and more people moving into the chat. But you're not actually asking people to expose whether they're right or wrong.
So some of the most disadvantaged students in Britain, possibly in Sunderland, and you're getting 100% attendance, is it? Well, nearly
not 100%, especially in COVID, but it has been astonishing in terms of attendance, in terms of, in relation to other years. They really have engaged with this because they can. And cameras have started to come on actually towards the end of the 9 weeks term. As they grow in confidence, you can start to see them shifting from, because you're not wrong with this. The important thing about this is you can be wrong backstage. You don't have to expose, not being able to do anything because you're doing it privately in your workbook. So I hope that's sort of coming across.
Right, I'm going to press you to drive on now, Kay.
So shall I keep going?
Yep, please do.
So, I mean, in a sense, these start to become more and more focused on the assessment tasks. So there were 2 related assessment tasks in this module. And we start helping them do, say, concept maps, which are about analysing a film or whatever it is that we're looking at. So they become more and more focused on the assessment tasks that are embedded in the module. But what I wanted to really stress was we don't ask any student to expose their draft, for instance. They're putting the key points that they would like to, that they're thinking of putting forward at the time. We're not asking to see their work or for them to show their work to anyone else. So they don't ever expose that kind of take on the material that they've initially produced. We do ask them to share what they've learned from doing that, and they will put that in chat. And so we get quite a good view of what's going on and what they think they've learned. And that helps us to see what's going on as well. So evaluation wise, I'm a bit conscious of the time. We're going to evaluate this more formally as once the students have finished the module. The teaching is finished now, but the assessment comes in tomorrow. But already we have a very good idea from what you can see going on in chat. You can see that we've been keeping teacher diaries throughout all of this. And I think we've picked out quite a few things where we've found this remarkably helpful. I mean, I would say it's been a lifesaver for us moving online, because it absolutely segues with ameliorating some of the anxiety and confidence that we had as teachers about going online and facilitating things remotely. And there, the first quote that I've put there is about this is my colleague talking, really liked it because the first year learners didn't have to share being wrong, because it's horrible sort of putting your stuff out there and somebody, as they see it, tearing it down, shooting it down in flames. But through the process of comparison with external examples, they can see for themselves. And what it does is it flags up when the student is unconsciously incompetent. That's when they're in the real danger zone, when they don't realise there's something else to get. And that has been flagged up much sooner with this method.
I love that comment. Far fewer questions in the FAQ discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Normally, last week would have gone absolutely red hot. The emails would have been ping, 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 ping. I don't know how to do this. You had hardly any. Absolutely astonishing. And I can talk to you when I've got a bit more time about some of the ways in which these students have responded and what it's meant for us, because it's very front loaded. It's not less work, it's just differently distributed, but it's been remarkably quiet in the run up to the formal summative assessment, because they're doing it all the way through and they've kind of got the sense of where they're developing. They can see how other people are going, but without that normal kind of anxiety about exposing their work in case somebody else nicks it. We haven't had, quite often we get that anxiety. I don't want to say what I'm doing for assessment because somebody else will pinch it. It's not asking you to do that. We're bringing along the comparators, which enable students to see for themselves how they're doing.
So press on to your next 2 slides about what students are saying.
I'll just dash past these because I think I think what we started to see is, and we see this in chat, and this is not the formal evaluation, we've started to see that the moments that they mention, the learning points that they mention in the expound phase each week start to get more and more developed, and you start to see them focusing on different kinds of things. So in the early days, they're starting to see that there are different perspectives, there's different ways of looking at things. They then start to see ways of approaching a topic and the whole idea of counter-argument, and they start to see the world differently, and that's actually what this is all about. This module is trying to tackle a threshold concept that childhood is much more complex and contested a space than most people imagine. And so it's a whole new way of seeing. So it's an absolute classic threshold concept. Once you've passed through that portal, you can never see it the same way again. And we're looking to blow their minds, and we're starting getting mind-blowing comments really early on, which is great for us.
Right, just one quick comment. Rosalina is enjoying this and said, where are the student comments? So 1 slide back and you'll be able to have a look at that a bit later. And we do want to give, excuse me, the last few minutes of this session, we want to give this to you, because our key point, the bit that's really important, the final step of the whole process, is asking you to have a think about how you might use it, but really, where for you are your key learning points from this workshop? Because that's what the process asks students to do. What have you learned? Where are the key learning points? So Helen's heading off to a meeting, but we would like to hear probably 3 or 4 people with their cameras on ideally, but not necessarily, who'd like to just pitch in.
Or stick it in chat. What we would ask the students to do is stick in chat what's the main thing you've learned from this workshop. And that's where so far we've been gathering, I mean, not formal data, but we get a real insight into the things that they're learning. So to round off the produce, compare, review process, this is the review bit. What's your key learning point, which is an externalization of your inner feedback from this workshop? Is there anything you're going to do differently?
And let's see if Verna wants to expound on the point she made. Verna?
Hello. No, I was just wondering, I mean, I totally agree, of course. It's just, so I'm obviously trying to encourage students to, within the context of these comparisons, let's call them, to do this peer assessment. So you know, you don't want to expose the students, but then if they don't share what they've done or what their outputs, then I'm not exactly sure how, I don't know whether it's a separate session or how would you do that? Because for example, today, I've really enjoyed this. Actually, it's been very refreshing. But if this was my, let's say, PG Cert lesson, I mean, at one point, I would like the students to tell each other and show each other, like show and tell.
Yeah. And,
So,
and the point is, Vienna, that they put all their comments into the chat box, and the whole chat box is available to them. So they've all got that, right? And what we're doing is we're doing an hour. Kay, your sessions are how long? Are they hour and a half?
So they're an hour. We would, of course, this would all be absolutely scaffolded into the learning design of the module. So it's quite hard to sort of pull it out. But in a sense, you build up very steadily. They do start to share, Werner, but they share, instead of the full draft, they're sharing key points.
yeah.
So sometimes they will, if the task has been a very straightforward, simple, short answer, they will put those in the chat and you do get to see them. But sometimes they're doing a synopsis of what of the task that they've just got involved in. But the main point is the choice of the comparators, because instead of, sometimes the comparators, as in your peer assessment, are coming from the population themselves. But what we're doing differently is bringing along comparators. So they're always doing that, but you can guide the analysis because you're guiding the analysis of the comparison information that you've brought along, and they're, rather than looking at real examples. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they're seeing your guidance, but the guidance is to an imaginary exemplar rather than them being either giving each other feedback, and you can't control for that because you don't know who's saying what to who in peer assessment or peer evaluation or peer review. So it's a slightly more controlled way of doing it because you've chosen the comparator examples.
Now, a number of people are saying they love the idea and they'd like to try and think how they could implement it. And I think for me, I'm very sort of taken with Mayer and Land's concept of threshold concepts. And really, for you on the childhood studies, getting them to get that idea that childhood was, you know, a whole range of different things. That was a threshold concept.
Oh, absolutely. So you hook it right round your learning outcomes. And it's, my colleague called it constructive alignment on speed. And so the key to it is absolutely that learning design, is the learning design of every week building towards the module learning outcomes, and sort of breaking down the tasks into supported sequential ones. That's absolutely key. It's got to be really well designed. You can't just chuck them in on 1 week, I don't think. And well, not do it in the way that we've done it. So I think that notion that you've designed it very carefully, that students are active, and so, I mean, that's absolutely inbuilt into it, but that's kind of what you want in online environments, isn't it? That students are actually doing something. And then this notion of social and teacher presence is absolutely palpable. So for me, as a complete novice to online learning, it kind of was an inbuilt mechanism which ensured that we were doing those 3 core things for online teaching.
You'll be delighted to know that Claire says her key learning point is design, select, recap framework in parallel with produce, compare, review and expand. And another useful point from Sue Horder saying key learning points, ensure the students have an opportunity to compare their work to make sense of feedback. And there's such a lot in there, that design, select, recap framework and so on. So there's huge amounts in there. Anne Bingham says, I'd like to integrate student productions, some fantastic ideas here. So we're coming up to the end. Kay, why don't you just show her the last 3 slides? And while I'm doing it, while you're doing that, why don't I invite 1 or 2 other people to just chip in with any particular comments, camera on or off. If you want to do that, just put your camera on, put your voice on and speak to us.
Good plan.
Just a quickie, Sally. One thought that's come out the thread, which I'm not sure you addressed directly, is working with students in groups as opposed to individuals and the balance of that. And maybe you could say a wee bit more about that.
Kay, you do a lot with your students working in groups, don't you?
Yeah, so we inherited the module, as you do, and we inherited the assessment, as you do, and the first module, the first assessment point, it was broken into a sort of 30%, 70%, was a group presentation. Oh, heck, we thought. But actually, this model worked very well with that, so we set them up to work in groups, and they were using this produce, review, recap and expound model in their groups. It worked perfectly in their seminar, in their groups for their group presentation. They had an individual contribution that they were all making, but they all got together and they planned it using the same model. What really struck me was the students absolutely grabbed the model of produce, compare, review by week 2. They were kind of on it like a rash. Because they could see it was helping them without being threatening. And it was I was astonished how good it was.
And do you want to say a quick word about Katrina's image on the next slide?
Yep, so I'm just going to do a quick pitch for our assessment conference next year, which will be on the slides that come round. Thanks ever so much for coming along. You can contact us this way. We're all in different institutions, and Katrina Swanton of Swanton Sketches is absolutely fantastic. Get her to come and do one of your conferences, because she can do a sketch note and she can do a synthesis of any event or a paper in our instance, and get it across in an absolute snapshot. She is a living legend, so please do look at her work.
Somebody's just mentioned it, weaning themselves off doing all the commenting.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, I see where you are. I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I can't see anything. I feel a bit...
Yeah. Thank you very much. They're not spring flowers, Farouk. It's a St. Lucy's night crown. St. Lucy is a Swedish saint of light, and St. Lucy's there because we celebrated that at the weekend. I'm quarter Swedish. Thank you.
There you are. I haven't seen any of you.
Okay, Kay and Sally, we're all back. I would like to thank you on behalf of SEDA for providing the perfect start to our winter festival. So we'll wind up now. Thank you very much. And we look forward to see you all again tomorrow.
And thank you to all of you for all your participation.
Yeah.
Bye
for now, folks.
Have a good Christmas, people.
Bye. And take some time off. No working in the holidays.
Yeah. A nice new year. Oh, there's Grandma.
New year, Kay, new hips.
Yeah. Oh, you see. Oh, yeah. Well, it's nice to see people. I was buried behind that presentation. I couldn't see a thing. Yeah.
Okay. Bye for now, folks.
Okay.
Bye.
See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.